Wonderful to be here in Dublin, Ireland. It's my second time here, and it's always been such a welcoming and wonderful city. I also appreciate the fact that the Ireland Network is doing a lot of work in open source, and they had a meetup last night to discuss open source in governments, open source in communities here. And I unfortunately could not make it, but that was a really terrific event. So my name, as Crow said, is Nithya Ruff. I chair the Linux Foundation board, and I also am lucky enough to lead a very, very talented group of people at Amazon in our open source program office. And I'd love to talk to you today about the history of open source and how the industry and communities and governments have come together over the last 30 years to solve really, really big problems, and why it makes sense that we're all coming together for OpenSSF to solve this problem of security. It really needs to start in the 1980s and 1990s. I think before the 80s and 90s, there were a period of time where software was free. In the mainframe era, it was given away because the hardware was what was sold. But then we went into a proprietary period where software became monetized and software became proprietary. And soon, people did not have access to the source code as they used to. And this was what really spurred someone in the labs in MIT, and I think all of you know who that is, to say we need better freedoms in software. We need to have access to the source code so we can actually examine it, we can actually modify it, we can change it for working with our situation, our use case, our hardware. And so Richard started the Free Software Foundation to preserve these freedoms and to advance these freedoms. He also, along with a group of very talented people, created the GNU toolchain system. And the most important one was the creation of the GPL license, the GNU public license, because that then started modifying or creating, if you will, a license that could be used to freely share software across the world and protect the four freedoms of being able to see the source code, being able to modify it, use it for anything you want, and to also distribute it freely. So this is an important moment, I think, in our history as an open source community. The second big milestone, I would say, was in the 1990s, where a young student in Finland decides to open source or decides to share the code he was writing for a microkernel called Linux, and he decides to use the GPL license to share his code. And soon people were working with him and collaborating with him on the code, and I truly believe that the license had a lot to do with how quickly the code proliferated and how quickly the code became central to a lot of print servers and servers across the world that we all use today. And Linux is so central to even the landing on Mars and our mobile phones. And I can't think of an application where we haven't used Linux today. The other couple of important institutions that came into being about the same time was the Open Source Initiative about 1998, and Linux was born in 1991. And Christine Peterson is credited with using the words open source for the first time. What ended up happening was a lot of us in companies were a little nervous about the words free software, and we thought that meant that we couldn't monetize it or that it needed to be free. And so the words open source, which Christine created in a consulting group around 1998, I think before 91 perhaps. Brian may know the exact date, but that helped us make it safe and kind of be descriptive about what it is and how to use it. And that became very important to the future of open source, if you will, in companies and governments, etc. Around 1998, you see the beginning of OSDL, which is Open Source Development Labs, and a bunch of companies like HP, IBM, SGI, Sun, and others came together to create open source development labs to really work on making Linux more enterprise grade, because it had entered the enterprise through, say, system admins and others bringing it into the company. And management said, yes, we do need to acknowledge that Linux is something that is a part of how we compute, how our stacks are built, and we do need to make it more enterprise grade and fill out some of the feature sets of Linux. And so you find that the next stage of maturity and growth in open source, you start finding more formal foundations being created. The Apache Foundation came into being, started by Brian and a bunch of others, and then the Linux Foundation, which was really a merger of OSDL and Free Software Group, which was another group that existed at that time. And those two became the Linux Foundation. And its purpose was to protect Linux, to promote Linux, to create, if you will, structures and frameworks so that people can come together in one place and create software and move that software forward, and really make it a safe place for companies to collaborate together, even competing companies to come together in one place and create software that solves major problems in technology and in the world. At the same time, I was working at Silicon Graphics at that time, about 1998, and I remember the Linux World used to be the event that we all went to, and you had Sun, SGI, HP, IBM, Red Hat, VA Linux, everyone working really hard to understand what it meant to work in open source, how to market in open source, how to use it in products, how to commercialize it, how to take it to market. And this particular slogan you see, peace, love, and the penguin, was a really good promotion that IBM did on the streets of San Francisco. They had these markers and these identities, so to speak, kind of all over the place. And they were actually fined for doing that, for graffitiing, if you will, the streets of San Francisco. But it turned out to be such a fantastic campaign, and it brought a lot more attention, if you will, to IBM. And IBM at that time donated $1 billion to moving Linux forward, and it was unheard of because, which big company, especially a company like IBM, which everyone believed in from a technology perspective, backing an upstart like Linux was seen as a big deal. And it really formalized for companies and for others that Linux is here to stay, and it's safe to use, and it's something that is kind of fundamental to technology stacks. So it's not surprising that soon after you start seeing web-scale companies like Google, Facebook, Amazon, Netflix, in building their data centers and building their infrastructures, start using open source. And they start using at scales that no one had really thought about before. And they help professionalize and harden and scale Linux and scale open source. And then they do something interesting also. They start open sourcing critical components that they've been using in their data centers to enrich, the world, and also to collaborate with others on. So you start seeing things like Hadoop come out of Yahoo. I think it came out of Yahoo. And then Facebook also open sources Cassandra, and you start seeing, Google open sourcing Kubernetes and so many other components, and Netflix also open sources Spinnaker, and You have OpenRTOS from Amazon and so many other components that start kind of building this vast sea of open source that we can all draw from. And these are hardened, tested in data centers, used at scale. And so it starts becoming building blocks, if you will, for a lot of us to use. Which led to the starting of the cloud. And cloud, really the data centers behind the cloud are built on open source. And then there is an opportunity to also deliver services, open source based services in the cloud. So you start seeing the rise of AWS and Google Cloud and IBM Clouds and Microsoft's Azure, and really trying to solve, making it easy for companies and making it easy for businesses to use open source effectively and use it at scale and use it as a service. This becomes an important component to what happens next, which is all of us enterprises, when I was at Comcast and all other banking enterprises that I've talked to, and retail and so many other businesses are digitizing, are moving to the cloud, have already moved to the cloud, and you can't not be digitally transformed today as a company. And you find that reaching customers, providing compelling experiences, managing the back office, et cetera, really requires digitization and requires services that can be provided anywhere, anytime to customers. And this was really spurred on because of all of the previous actions that took place. You know, it became safer to use open source, and you have all these institutions that make it easier to collaborate on open source, and then you have all of these web-scale softwares being available and the cloud being available, and you find that enterprises now of all kinds, from finance, which are very conservative, to entertainment and to medicine and pharmaceutical, are using open source to reach their customers and to move faster. The notion that open source is only software is also wrong. And you find that institutions like Open Compute and RISC-V are starting to then say, how can we collaborate on hardware? And at one point in time, it was felt that hardware is difficult to collaborate on because of the fact that you have to have physical hardware, and it's hard to share that physical hardware. And but Open Compute and RISC-V has shown that specifications and how to work together on open hardware is possible and is very successful. And then you find open source transforming so many new industries that never really were collaborating together, were very physical, needed a lot of infrastructure to work together, whether it's agriculture or energy or even medicine and healthcare are industries that are being transformed by open source. And I think having institutions, whether it's the Apache Software Foundation or the Linux Foundation, make it easy for these organizations to come together in one place and then decide what are the common components that we need to work together on, and how do we put that into software, how do we collaborate with each other, how do we work together to make this happen. And open source in governments has been growing steadily, and government interest in open source has been growing steadily. Governments need to reach a number of different constituents. They need to reach their citizenry. They need to develop industry in their countries. They also need to attract great talent into their own organizations. They are left behind if they don't have great talent in government. And open source has been a powerful enabler for governments to digitally transform just like enterprises did, and to reach all of these constituents. It's also been a great software, or a great if you will, way to create trust among their citizenry and among their industries as well, by having transparency in terms of the software that's used, and to collaborate with citizenry and with industries to grow government services and to connect government to all of these constituents. And in the pandemic in particular, governments that digitally transformed and were able to work with their citizens in a digital way did extremely successfully. So what happens is, with success, now with open source being everywhere and being used by everybody, comes great responsibilities. And I think it exposes some of the challenges that OpenSSF is trying to solve. You find that the open source security challenge is that those who are supplying the software sometimes are a number of different projects. They are sometimes big, sometimes small. Some are highly funded, some are not funded. Some have knowledge of how to create secure code, some don't. But all of them also tend to focus more on the technical problem solving as opposed to productizing or creating secure code. That lack of focus sometimes on security tends to then show up downstream with users. And maintainer burnout has been another area that has created that stack diagram that you see of this one component being supported by one person, and then the whole world depending upon that component, and then discovering that that project does not have enough support and does not have enough funding. So this is the nature of the supply side from a security perspective. And then on the user side, you find that users, today use it for all kinds of mission critical purposes. It is not said that this is only to be used for experimental work. It's used everywhere to support major clouds, to support major missions to the Mars. It's such a big critical component of all of our infrastructures. And what that means is it then starts showing, or it becomes even more critical to fix things quickly when we discover it. And developers today may not know some of the history of licenses or vulnerabilities or how open source is created, because their world exists with open source in it. And so they're used to seeing open source as something that they can use in their development work. And so they take it for granted. They don't examine it as carefully as they would if they were creating it themselves or getting it from a supplier. And some of the dependency management tools have also been not as good, not as adequate to use for understanding supply chain and understanding where the problems are coming from. And it's hard to, in a large company, find a single owner, if you will, for a certain component and say, if you're using this component, you need to work with upstream and make sure that it's secure and safe. And if you find vulnerabilities, you will communicate to the rest of the company. So it's hard. So companies are still working on how do we work upstream? How do we establish ownership inside the company for a component? How do we work together to make sure that everyone in the company who's using this is using this effectively? So this is the conundrum that OpenSSF is also trying to solve, is how do we help suppliers do better software? How do we help users use the software more effectively? And this leads us to the reason why collaboration is so important today. Security learns the power of collaboration. Security typically has worked in isolation. Different security teams in different companies have been very mum and kind of quiet about any issues that come up. But now you really need to collaborate and help each other with solving these problems, sharing vulnerabilities, sharing secure coding practices, sharing best practices for how to write secure code, but how to work better together. And we need to also respond very, very quickly when problems happen. So collaboration is really at the heart of what OpenSSF is trying to do and is so badly needed, particularly in open source security, whether it's the government mandating things or industry saying we need to work better together because this is the problem we all face, and then really finding a foundation or a central place to work together. That's what is so much needed and what OpenSSF provides today. So with that, I think I may have saved some time, but thank you for listening to the history and why we are at the point we are and why we need to do what we need to do. And I appreciate your time today.